You describe a turning point that happened in the years after the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 that ultimately led to your family's displacement and the displacement of over 100,000 Jews from Iraq and many others from other Arab countries. What happened in that period of time that changed this landscape that you described of coexistence into something that became kind of a threat to the Jews that were living in these countries?
What changed was the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. Israel was a Jewish state. Um, the Jews had lived in Iraq since the 6th century BC, 2.5 millennia ago, since the time of the Babylonian exile. But the creation of the State of Israel, for the first time, gave a territorial dimension to Zionism, which it didn't have before. That's the big change, because it was now possible to identify Iraqi Jews as the other. And also, Iraqi Jews, whether they liked it or not, were identified with the Zionist movement. And the great majority were non-Zionist. Iraq was their homeland. They wanted to stay in Iraq. But after Israel was created, the Jews throughout the Middle East were identified with Israel, with the enemy. And 1948 was the first Arab-Israeli war. The Iraqi army fought in Palestine. At the end of the war, after the guns fell silent, all the neighboring Arab states, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, signed armistice agreements with Israel, but the Iraqi army retreated, and the Iraqi government refused to sign an armistice agreement with Israel. So Iraq is still officially at war with Israel. So that's the real turning point, when there was a Jewish state, and any Arab nationalists, and there had been a huge upsurge of Arab nationalism from the 30s onwards. Arab nationalists could say to the Jews in Iraq, you don't belong here, you're outsiders, you belong to the enemy, why don't you go and join your brothers in Palestine? And there were right-wing parties, the Istiqlal Party, the Independence Party, which adopted this policy. They were very hostile to the Jews. They called for the confiscation of the property of the Jews and for the expulsion of the Jews from Iraq. The only party which stood by the Jews after 1948 was the Communist Party, which said, no, the Jews are not outsiders, they are not an enemy, they are part of our society, and they stood by the Jews in Iraq.
And amid this environment that was brewing, this environment of nationalism and mistrust towards Jewish Arabs, there were a series of attacks that you document that took place in other Arab countries, in Egypt, but specifically in Iraq. You document quite extensively. What you say is proof that of these attacks, there were a number that were orchestrated not by the Arabs in Iraq, but by Zionist underground militants and people that were trying to create this sense of fear among Jewish communities. What did you uncover through your research?
So after the 1948 war, there was mounting popular hostility towards the Jews in Iraq and the rest of the Arab world. And more importantly, there was persecution by the government of the Jews. This is very important because the government used the Jews as a scapegoat for the Arab defeat in Palestine, and a scapegoat for the failure of its own internal policies. So it was very convenient to pick on the Jews and say, they are to blame. And it wasn't just rhetorical. The government pursued official policies of discrimination. Jews were fired from the government service. Restrictions were placed on the activities of Jewish traders and Jewish bankers, and a quota was imposed on the number of Jews who could go to university. And I think that's the main reason for the Jewish exodus from Iraq. But it wasn't the only reason. Another reason was that 5 bombs exploded in Jewish sites between 1950 and 1951. In March 1950, the Iraqi government passed a law which said any Jew who wants to leave the country is free to do so. They have a year to register. And initially, very few Jews opted to up sticks and go and live in Israel. But the situation deteriorated, and the series of bombs created a panic and a sense of uncertainty which led more and more Jews to register to leave the country. I was always interested in the question of the bombs, because in Israel there were persistent rumors that Israel had a hand in the bombings, and Iraqi Jews were convinced that Israel had a hand in uprooting them, and they were very resentful of that. And I wanted to know whether this is true or not. And when I grew up and I was a historian, I investigated this question. And I didn't want to just repeat conspiracy theories. I wanted to get to the bottom of the matter. And eventually I did. In the course of writing this memoir, I met an elderly friend of my mother's, an Iraqi Jew called Yaakov Karkukli, who had been in the Zionist underground, and he told me a lot about their activities, what they were up to, what they were doing, forging documents, forging passports, paying bribes to officials to facilitate the movement of Jews from Iraq to Israel. And he also told me that one member of his group was called Yosef Basri, a very, very intelligent Jewish lawyer, age 28, who was an ardent Zionist. Basri and his assistant, Shalom Saleh Shalom, were responsible for 3 out of the 5 bombs. The one bomb was against a bomb exploded in a Jewish cafe, Al-Baida, and I know from an Iraqi source that the perpetrator was a young activist in the Istiklal Party, and this was part of the Istiklal Party's policy of frightening the Jews, accelerating the exodus. Another bomb, the most famous bomb, was a hand grenade that exploded in the Mas'uda Shem Tov synagogue, and there 4 Jews were killed. In all the others, there was damage to property and some injuries, but no one was killed. Here there are 4 fatalities. So this is a famous bomb. And again, Karkukli told me that Basri was not responsible for that one, but he was responsible for the 3 other bombs. And he told me something else, that Basri's controller was an Israeli intelligence officer named Max Binet, who was based in Tehran. Iran in those days under the Shah had covert relations with Israel. So this intelligence officer could operate from Tehran, and he was the controller of Basri. He guided him, he gave him the TNT, he gave him, and Basri was caught and his assistant, and they were tried. I believe it was not a show trial, but a fair trial. The evidence was produced. Some of the TNT from one of the sites matched the TNT, traces of TNT in Basri's car. So Basri and his assistant were tried, convicted, sentenced to death, and they were hanged.
And Max Bennett, I believe, was tried in absentia later for a similar case in Egypt.
Yes, that's correct. And this is very important, the link. Max Binet was involved in the Lavon affair. The Lavon affair was named after Pinchas Lavon, the Minister of Defense at the time, and in 1954 there was a Jewish ring of spies and saboteurs under the control of Max Binet, who by this time had moved to Cairo. The purpose of the terrorist attacks of this group, planting bombs in public places, was to create bad blood between the Nasser regime and the West. So it was a false flag operation, like the false flag operations in Iraq in 1951. But one bomb went off prematurely. The whole ring, all the people in the ring were arrested. So was Max Binet, and he committed suicide in prison. And so the importance of, I tell the story of of the Lavon affair in 1954 because I wanted to show that the bombings in Baghdad in 1950-51 were not a one-off thing, that it was part of a pattern of false flag operations, and it was part of what somebody described as cruel Zionism. And this was particularly cruel because it involved innocent Jews, decent Jews, good people, and the Zionist movement or the intelligence officers turned these Jews in Baghdad and then later in Cairo, they turned them into terrorists. They turned them into spies and terrorists against their own homeland. And these people paid the price. Some lost their freedom, some lost their lives, and all of them lost the relationship. They lost their homeland. And moreover, these operations really antagonized Iraqis, non-Jewish Iraqis, and they really turned the Egyptian society against the Jews in general because of these false flag operations.
Comment if you agree, or not, or just have any thoughts on this expression. Please avoid abusive use of language and don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Thank you.